Morning. I'll call this meeting of the TSDAC to order. My name is John McGlennon. I serve as chair of TSDAC, and I will start the meeting with a reading of a virtual meeting statement. In light of the continuing state of emergency declared by Governor Northam, where it is impracticable or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location, and as allowed by the General Assembly during the continuing state of emergency, this meeting to take action to discuss or transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue operation of the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee will take place virtually. Okay. I have called the meeting to order, and again, I'm John McGlennon. I'm a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, and on TSDAC, I represent the Virginia Association of Counties, and I currently serve also as president of the Virginia Transit Association. I'm just going to call folks as I see them listed here. Tom, did you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Hey, Tom, I think you're muted. We're having trouble hearing you.
So
maybe we'll come back to Tom. Kate Mattice.
Good morning, Kate Mattice. I'm with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and I'm here representing the Virginia Transit Association. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And I see, I'm going to skip over Jamie for a minute. Cindy Mester.
Good morning, everyone. Cindy Mester, Deputy City Manager for the City of Falls Church and representing on TSDAC from VML, and have the opportunity to serve as co-chair on TSDAC. Good to see everybody again. It's been a while.
It has been a while, yeah. Jen DeBrule, I see you there.
Good morning, Jen DeBrule. I'm the Chief of Transit at DRPT. And if I could, for 1 second, I would like to recognize a couple of new folks on our end, if I could, or we can come back to that.
Yeah.
So everybody saw Haley, or everybody was greeted by Haley. She is our new communication specialist, and so she's online today and available to help us if we have any technology challenges through this. I also want to share that we have a couple of different presenters with us today than you have typically seen. We have Andy Wright is our new Manager of Communications, Legislative Affairs and Policy. So he's going to do our legislative update today. And Steve Pittard, if you haven't heard, is the new CFO at the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. So we have the acting CFO, Jamie Motley, with us today to do our financial update. So a couple of changes on our end that I wanted to point out early on.
Great. Thanks very much, Jen. Let's see. I see another one of our new members. I'll pass over you for a minute, Brian. And now I'm running out of people on my end here. So who else have I missed?
Jim Dyke is now on.
Jim, good. Just like to introduce yourself to folks.
Just a country lawyer in Northern Virginia. Former Secretary of Education, former CTB member, WMATA board member, big supporter of transit. So I'm glad to be back here and seeing you folks again.
Always glad to have you on. Yeah. And other members?
This is Tom. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Tom.
Oh, good. Okay. So you want me to reintroduce myself?
Please do.
I'm the outgoing representative of the Community Transportation Association of Virginia.
Great. Okay.
Sorry about that.
And thanks, Tom. We'll have a few words to say about that in just a minute. And other members that I can't see. Is that it, Jen?
I think you got everybody.
Okay, then let me turn back to two new members to introduce. Jamie Jackson is with us now from Fred, but representing the Department of Rail and Public Transit. Jamie, would you like to introduce yourself? It's been a long time since I've seen you in person, but I know I've seen you since your days at WATA.
Yes. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Jackson. I am the Director of Public Transit and Transportation for Fredericksburg Regional Transit in the city of Fredericksburg. Also, as known as Fred, I've been with Fred for about a year, and I appreciate Mrs. DeBrule extending the offer to be a part of this committee. So thank you.
And Tom's replacement from CTAB is Brian Booth. Brian, would you like to say hello?
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Booth, and I'm with the Greater Lynchburg Transit. I serve as the general manager here. Been with GLTC for approximately 4 years, and I will be filling Tom Fox's role as the CTAB appointee upon his retirement this summer. And I've been serving on the CTAB board since 2014.
Great. Thank you very much. And welcome to both of you. We know this has been a very productive and congenial group, and glad to have you part of it now. My understanding we wanted to take an opportunity to recognize Tom for all of his service. Jen, did you have something you wanted to do here, or no? Okay.
Just wanted to thank Tom for sticking with us through he came on right at the right time to be part of the development of merit for capital, operating, and strategic plans. And so I wanted to give express my personal gratitude and gratitude on behalf of DRPT for the great partnership we've had with Tom over the years, and just to wish him all the best in his retirement. And just grateful that he took the time to be part of this journey with all of us.
Yeah, and on behalf of the advisory committee, Tom, you've been a great member, very regular in your attendance, and your contributions to our discussions have been essential. It's really been important to have everybody represented at the table, and you've done a great job in your role representing CTAB.
Well, thank you very much. It's been nice to get to know all the committee members and to work with DRPT. And I got to say that everybody has contributed on a regular basis with good input, and DRPT and their consultants have always been well prepared and made our job pretty easy, I would say, too. But I appreciate
well, not that easy, right, Tom? We want to take a little bit of credit.
That easy. Could have been a lot worse.
You're right. We couldn't be nearly as productive as the committee has been without all the great work by staff and by our consultants. With that, we'll move into the agenda for today's meeting, and I believe that we begin with a legislative update. Andy Wright's going to bring us through what's been happening. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me here today. This is a big day for me. This is, I think, the third time in 14 months that I've put on a suit, so it still fits, so that's good as well. The 2021 session was another big year for transportation, and I keep saying that after every session here for about 5 years now. I started at DRPT and right before the 2017 session, and 2017 we have Washington Metro Rail Commission. 2018 was another big year with WMATA, dedicated funding, the merit reforms. 2019, we had the operating assistance, transitional assistance, and then 2020 was the big omnibus bill, and 2021 was another big year. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So today I'm just going to touch on four major areas. There was the 2021 Transportation Funding Initiative that was put in the biennial budget. Then we had the Transit Equity and Modernization Study, HJ 542, that was introduced by Delegate Dolores McQuinn, House Transportation Chairperson here in Richmond. We had some changes to our new Transit Ridership Incentive Program, and then also some changes to the strategic plan requirements. Next slide, please. So the 2021 Transportation Funding Initiative, which is item 447.10 in the biennial budget, took $323.4 million in one-time funding and dedicated it to several transportation projects. The big number was $233.4 million in And I wrote this down: Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act funding. That was the December 2020 stimulus package that Congress passed, and it dedicated funding to highway infrastructure programs. The next two rows, 35 million in uncommitted balances in existing funding, and then we also had 555 million in general funds, for a total of 323.4 million in one-time funding dedicated to transportation projects. And my next slide will show where that funding is going. 83.5 million is going to expanding intercity passenger rail service along the I-29 and I-81 corridors, specifically, hopefully with a second train to Roanoke, and then an extension of service into the New River Valley. Another 83.5 million going for commuter rail improvements along the VRE Manassas line. The next row is 32.4 million will be dedicated to the WMATA Capital Fund and also to Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. And let me just give you a little bit more details on that. Obviously, WMATA Capital Fund, 154.5 million a year. It has 5 or 6 dedicated funding streams, and with the pandemic, those funding streams have been hard hit, especially the transit occupancy tax. So in FY21, we saw a significant decline in those revenues, and we are using revenues from bonds to fill in the gap in FY21. This funding would be used to fill in the gap in FY22, and whatever funding is left over will go to reduce the FY22 operational obligation of NVTC's member jurisdictions. The current estimate right now is the shortfall for WMATA Capital Fund would be approximately 22 million, leaving about 10 million left over for NVTC. The next row, 10.9 million going to zero fare transit pilot programs, and I will explain that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. And then the next 3 rows, not really transit or rail projects, but those are some other projects where the funding is going to. 93 million towards I-64 corridor improvements, specifically, I think adding a 3rd lane in each direction between Williamsburg and Richmond. 10 million towards trails, and then 10 million to the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute up in Northern Virginia. Next slide, please. So again, HJ 542, introduced by Delegate McQuinn, is the Transit Equity and Modernization Study. And that is directing DRPT to study transit accessibility, transit infrastructure, electrification, emerging technology, safety, and system engagement, with a specific focus on transit services and engagement opportunities in underserved and underrepresented communities. The procurement for this, we are procuring consultants to complete this study, went out in March, and we have received proposals that are being reviewed right now. So the study will be getting underway here in the next month or so. And we're sort of copying the timeline of the Transit Revenue Advisory Board with this project, with the hope of having an interim report by the end of this year, and then a full report in a year and a half from now, in the summer of 2022. A little bit more about that last bullet. If you remember on the prior slide, I said that 10.9 million was dedicated to zero fare transit programs. Out of that 10.9, we can take up to $900,000 of that and dedicate it to paying for this study. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the Transit Ridership Incentive Program. In 2020, in the Omnibus Bill, that bill dedicated 6% of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund to this new program. And then within the program, at least 75% of the funds were going to be dedicated to improving transit service in urbanized areas. And at least $5 million of those funds were going to be used to provide operating assistance to reduce congestion in urbanized areas, specifically looking at the long distance commuter service that PRTC, Loudoun County run, GRTC runs here in the Richmond area. And then up to 25% would be used for the low fare, reduced fare, zero fare programs. The 2021 General Assembly revisited this program and made some changes. As I noted a few slides ago, dedicates up to 10.9 million to establish pilot programs for fare-free transit. And then it reduced from 5 million to 3.6 million the amount for operating assistance to aid congestion in urbanized areas. And if you all think about it, that makes sense. With more people staying at home, teleworking, there's less of a need for long distance commuter service and more of a need to look at fare-free programs to use for essential workers during the pandemic. My next slide, please. Strategic plans. Back in 2018, the merit program required a strategic plan every 5 years from transit agencies that serve a population greater than 50,000 and had a fleet larger than 20 buses. I think that's about 15 agencies across the state. And then it also mandated that WMATA update its strategic plan every 3 years. The 2021 budget, and this was a proposal that originated here at DRPT, language was placed in the budget to delay those strategic plan requirements due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. With a change in ridership patterns, and then a need for transit agencies to focus on, just on services right now, we thought it would be best to delay these requirements until things start to return back to normal. That was all my slides, and I'm happy to take any questions or turn the floor over to Mr. Motley, who is here in the office with me, who is having some technical difficulties. So he's going to share my laptop, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for the very comprehensive report. Does anybody have questions for Andy about the legislative program?
Chair, this is Cindy.
Yes, Cindy.
And sorry, I can figure out how to raise my hand and go to meeting. I'm not as familiar. I just had a question or comment. I just wanted to note for the slide that talks about the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, $10 million. That actually is a partnership with the City of Falls Church, and we'll be working closely with MBTA, BTC, Fairfax County, and we look forward to having some smart city connected infrastructure happening that also can tie into the future rapid bus transit project that we're working with MBTC on. And as a side note, I have some federal money requested with Congressman Beyer that we hope to supplement with it as well. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
I'd like to ask about the strategic plan, the coordination or the overlap between TDPs and strategic plans, because I know that in our area, our TDP was fairly recent and it qualified as a strategic plan. So can you talk a little bit about when the next time, say, agencies like ours would have to do a strategic plan?
I think I will defer to Mr. Brule on answering that.
Happy to take that one. So the original language for the transit strategic plans required that we establish a 5-year phase-in for all of the transit strategic plans to be in place. And so we put together an implementation schedule back in 2018, 2019 that laid that out over a 5-year period. And so agencies like Blacksburg that had just completed a TDP that had all of the provisions for the strategic plan were kind of, I don't know, addressed early in the process, and then with the intent that they would come back and they would be kind of doing a new TSP towards the end of that 5-year phase-in. With this language that we sought, kind of knowing that this isn't the best time necessarily to do a transit strategic plan, I think we need to go back and revisit that schedule and that plan, because now your plan's got some age on it, a couple of years, and so we may need to go back and kind of restructure those phases that we had laid out initially for the implementation of the transit strategic plan requirement. I think that's a great question, because we do have agencies that are in all different places on that timeline right now. Now, Jamie and Fredericksburg, they're getting ready to start their efforts soon.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Great. Well, thank you very much, Andy, for the report. Very comprehensive.
Thank you.
And let me note that Director Mitchell has joined us. Jennifer, how are you?
I'm very good. It's good to see you all, and I'm sorry for being a little late, but I was in another meeting with the secretary that ran a little long. But it's good to see you all, and hopefully we will be able to do one of these in person in the future again soon.
Look forward to that. Right. So we'll move on then to Jamie. Jamie's acting as our CFO while as Steve has moved over to another position. So,
thank
Jamie,
you, Mr. Chairman.
You.
Nice to see you too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Next slide, please. And we'll be talking to you about the 6-year program this year. This first slide is just a comparison of our last 5 years. And as you can see, and as Andy spoke about, in the 19 to 24 6-year program, there's a huge jump of about $1 billion, and that is due to the implementation of the WMATA dedicated program. And then in 21 to 26, you see a big drop off, but that's really just due to the fact that we only presented 2 years due to the pandemic and the uncertainty and surrounding revenue estimates at the time. And we've got another increase in 22 to 27, which is mostly due to finally funding PRIA for the full 6 years. That money, that $50 million a year, will now be coming out of the Mass Transit Trust Fund. So that increased the 22 number. Next slide, please. And this is just a breakdown of our programs for 22 to 27. You'll see a big uptick in operating the first year, and that's mainly due to some 20 million of ARPA funding that we got that's going to be going to our small urbans under the governor's apportionment, 5307 money. And capital is up this year as well, because due to the pandemic, people hadn't been putting as much in their applications for the last couple of years. But this year we saw everything catch up, and there were actually projects we're probably not going to be able to fund. WMATA's that's made up of the WMATA operating and capital money, as well as the dedicated money, as well as the 50 million for PRIA. So that's what makes up the WMATA piece. Next slide, please. This just shows how much state money we've put into operating over the last 10 years. And as you get the orange bars at the bottom, it's always been around 20 to 23% of total operating expenses. So, and we also under merit, there's a 30% cap on operating. So that's getting close to what we can actually give all the different transit entities. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you that we're recommending that the CTB increase our reserve from 7.9 million up to $10 million. And so I hope they'll do that, and that'll fully fund the reserve. That's the max we can put in there right now. And I'll also point out for operating, the regular transit operating, there is a 2% increase for all the transit entities, as well as WMATA NVTC. Next slide, please. See, that's it. See, Andy's the communication person. I just talk about the numbers. I don't have much to say.
We'll see if anybody has any questions for you or comments, Jamie.
Please. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I think Jen's up next.
Thanks for the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I will pick up where Jamie left off and do our annual retrospective on our merit process. As you'll recall, our CTB policy does include that language that every year we walk back through and look at how the process worked and the outcomes. So that's what I've got for you today. All right, so I'll give you a little, drop some slides we use every year just to kind of recap where we've been and how we got here. Our merit state capital prioritization went into effect July 1st of 2019, fiscal year 2020. So this fiscal year 22 cycle is our third run through the process. We do have state of good repair and minor enhancements that we do prioritize based on transit asset management principles and service impact factors. And then we have our major expansion projects that are based on the same factor areas as Smart Scale with some different metrics. So in terms of this year's program, as Jamie mentioned already, we did have a very significant request or ask overall for state-controlled capital funding. We did receive requests for a total of $216 million in state-controlled capital funds across almost 600 individually evaluated projects. This does represent a larger request than recent fiscal years, but it is very much consistent with the Transit Capital Needs Assessment that was prepared in 2019 and presented to you in December of that year. And it's also consistent with the bar chart trend. If you think back all the way to the Transit Capital Projects Revenue Advisory Board, there was always this peak in fiscal 22 that really aligns with vehicle replacement projects for some very large transit systems. So just to kind of refresh your memory on that, I dropped in a slide from 2019. That's why the color scheme is a little different. But this is the graphic that Dan Son and Clara of our team used to walk you through the transit capital needs that we were projecting at that time. And you'll see that bar for fiscal year 22 is much higher than the other years. The ask this year was slightly above what was predicted in this analysis, but it was very close. So what were we able to do in terms of funding? So we did present our capital program to the Commonwealth Transportation Board last week. It is a very state of good repair focused program. We are very pleased that we were able to really lean into the merit process. I'm very thankful we have a prioritization process that gives us, a strong technical backbone to work off of. So we did recommend state of good repair projects that replace assets that are basically at their useful life. Our metric, if you'll recall from scoring, is that they meet or exceed 95% of their useful life. So that's what the blue bar represents, is those projects. We also did recommend some high scoring minor enhancement projects, primarily expansion buses and some small technology and maintenance projects. But the notable absence of funding is in the major expansion category, where we did not recommend any major expansion projects for funding. And that is consistent with the CTV policy, where we have prioritized state of good repair and minor enhancement over major expansion to help maintain that state of good repair and follow our asset management plans. So let's walk through each one of those in a little more detail. And as we do that, I'll start and I'll revisit. We've seen this graphic many times, but our scoring methodology, just as a refresher, 60% or 60 points of our score is based on asset condition, that's age and mileage, and then 40 points are calculated based on service impact. So that gets us to our state of good repair technical score, which is up to 100 points. In terms of our recommendations this year, we did evaluate over 450 individual projects and line items for state of good repair. We're recommending funding 374 of those. That represents a score of 40 or higher on that 100-point scale. The projects that scored well, this is very consistent with our prior 2 years of experience with merit. Our revenue and support vehicle replacements and rehabilitations, they score at the top of the list, as well as equipment that supports operations that exceeds its useful life, and then administrative and maintenance facilities, parts and equipment, things that we have a documented age and can calculate that useful life. The large portion of the program, in fact, 95% of our allocations for state of good repair are going to revenue vehicles. And that is significant. This is a very state of good repair, very focused on the customer experience and the stability and effectiveness of service. I mean, we are focused on those revenue vehicles in this state of good repair recommended project list. The projects that did not score well, this is again very consistent with prior years. Assets that aren't yet at their useful life for age and mileage don't score as well, and as such have not been recommended for funding. Again, just a refresher for our minor enhancements, because we don't have age information for those minor enhancement projects, we do score them on a 40-point scale that's based solely on their service impact. And for minor enhancements this year, we did evaluate 135 individual projects. We're recommending 62 of those projects for funding. That represents a score of 21 or higher. We did, I will say, make a slight deviation from the prioritization, straight up prioritization in making our recommendation for funding. HRT had a large vehicle expansion project that was associated with their new 757 Express regional service, which is being funded through the Hampton Roads Regional Transit Fund that's managed by the Hampton Roads Regional Transportation Accountability Commission. We did split that project because because they have, for a couple of reasons, they have other funding that they can tap into to support that vehicle expansion project. And by funding half of that project, we were able to go a little bit deeper into the minor enhancement list and pick up some system infrastructure maintenance and some equipment projects that we thought were a high priority for those agencies and relatively small in a dollar value. So our process continues to work the way we expected. Our vehicles score well, technology and equipment that's around operations scores well, and our maintenance and infrastructure projects continue to score well. One thing that we did see that was very different this year, and this is indicative of the fact that we were not able to go as deep in the minor enhancement prioritization as we have in previous years, is that we did not get far enough into that list to fund customer facility enhancements, things like bus stops and shelters. Typically, those do make the cut for funding, so that is a change this year, and really is tied to that large ask on the state of good repair side. And then we have discussed in previous years that the equipment for administrative support just doesn't score well under the merit prioritization process. In terms of funding, compared to $90 million for state of good repair, the total funding that is being applied to minor enhancements is $19 million, and that's broken up, in smaller categories, but the biggest chunks are going to technology equipment, revenue vehicles, and system infrastructure. So in terms of where we are with the policy, I mentioned at the beginning that we do this retrospective every year, look at how the process is working, and talk with TSDAC about our outcomes. But the CTB policy also requires us to do a review of the policy at least every 3 years. So we've got a little bit of extra, taken a little bit extra look at the process this year. The scoring process does continue to work as expected. We really haven't hit, beyond some growing pains with the first year and some minor adjustments. The process itself is working as expected. Again, very grateful that we had it this year to work through such a large capital request and be able to make some technically focused recommendations to the CTB. But I think one thing that's really jumped out at us this year is that the amount of the request for state of good repair in fiscal 22 does demonstrate that we still do have a state of good repair backlog, and we still have kind of this lumpiness in the program that we have to work through. So our recommendation to the TSDAC is that we stay the course and not make any policy changes at this time. I think last year we had talked that maybe it's, maybe we're getting to the time where we can start looking at maybe adjusting those age and mileage scores to try to align those vehicle replacements so that they are funded and the vehicles can arrive by the time the funding, by the time they age out. But with this large request this year, it shows us we still have some work to do to try to smooth out the program over time. So that is our staff recommendation for the capital side. I think this is probably a good place to stop and see if there are any questions on the capital part of the program.
Right. I think that's right. Jenny anticipated a question I was going to have, which is about whether we're able to do anything about the fact that it does take a while to get these assets online, and to try to see if there's a way to match better the state of good repair with when you would actually replace that vehicle after getting authorization. So thank you for that. Is there anything about what we've been going through that you think needs to be highlighted in terms of the impact of the pandemic on this aspect of our evaluations?
Not so much the impact of the pandemic, but Andy mentioned earlier that we're starting to work on the statewide equity and modernization study that was included in the General Assembly this year. And I do think that, aside from COVID and the impacts of the pandemic, I think the equity conversations that have happened over the past year have been just as significant, if not more so long-term than the pandemic. And I think that work that we're going to be doing over the next year is really an opportunity for us to inform the merit process. And I know one of the things that came up at CTB last week was, one of our board members was very concerned that we weren't able to fund bus stop improvements this year. And that is a real equity consideration. And so I do think we have some places that we need to, to think about the impacts of COVID and the impacts of the things that happened in our country over the past year in looking at potential modifications to the capital prioritization process. So I do think we have opportunities to do that, but I would like for that to be informed by some work we're going to get going here shortly.
And I'll just ask one last question before I open up to others, and that is, if we had funded all of the requests that were reasonably made, how much would that have increased spending?
So I'm limited in what I could do right now because I'm sharing my screen, but our request was 216 million in request, and I think Jamie had on his slide is about 160 million is what we were able to fund. So our gap was, and Jamie can correct me, but I think it was about $50 million that we did not get through this year. But I failed to mention it on the earlier slide. We did a real deep dive on the capital needs assessment back in 2019, separate from our program. And one of the things that we learned is how valuable that capital needs assessment and deep dive has been to, informing the conversations that have happened since 2019. One of the things that we're going to do, we're doing it right now, is, each year, each agency submits a 5-year capital budget with their request for funding for the current fiscal year. Because we've left such a significant chunk of projects that we're not able to fund this year, we know that then affects what the next 5 years look like that are in that 5-year capital budget that goes on to be part of our 6-year program. So our team at DRPT are working with the transit agencies to go back and say, for things that didn't get funded, let's move those out into your 5-year capital budget so that we can make that a true annual capital needs assessment that's incorporated into our 6-year program so that we can always lean into and have more time, quite frankly, to consider where we have, could potentially have gaps in our funding, or if we have, as we've said before, this very lumpy program where it takes 2 or 3 big agencies with big vehicle purchases, and it kind of throws things off kilter for a couple of years. So I wanted to also mention that, because I do think that will help us going forward to smooth out this process over time.
Great, thank you. Anybody have questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, this is Kate Mattice. I do have 2 questions. One's really quick. Will the scores be available, or are the scores already available for the applicants to the merit program?
That is a great question, and Kate, we usually do post those on our webpage, and I'm not sure we've done that yet.
Inquiring minds want to know, so I'll just put that little bit.
Absolutely, we can put it out there. I think in a typical year, we would have done a briefing for the CTB Rail and Transit Subcommittee up front and have released all of that. And with us being in a virtual environment, that just fell off our radar, but we can definitely do that.
No worries, that's why I figured I'd mention it. The other question is really related in some ways to capital, but also to operating, which is being mindful of the federal funding that came in through CARES, CRISA, and ARPA. I know you guys don't have a crystal ball, but are you getting a sense that how that's able to cover some expenses from our transit agencies that may actually provide a little bit of a relief valve to the state program?
That is a great question. So DRPT is a recipient of the CARES, CRISA, ARPA funding for the rural transit agencies. And so we have used that. We used it in the FY21 program, and we're doing it to some extent again this year to help offset or to conserve state funding and utilize that federal. So that money going to the rural programs actually enabled us to free up some state funding and help our state dollars go further. On the urban agency side, I think those agencies have reported some of that federal funding in their operating applications to us, but ARPA passed after those applications were submitted. So I mean, we're actively engaged with the transit agencies and kind of keeping an eye on that. I think that's primarily helping on the operating side and helping to offset some increased cost and things on that side, which is why we felt more strongly about trying to do more on the capital side this year than maybe increasing or having a larger increase in our state operating funding.
Okay, anybody else have questions or comments?
I have one, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
The question that I have is really directed for the small urban areas and the loss of the use of flexible STP funds. And I know that it hit us as a little bit of a shock, and we're working internally to figure out if we can come up with the local match, whether it be through the CARES and ARPA funds or just increasing the local share. If agencies are to, I guess, relinquish a project because they cannot come up with the local match to support it this year, what would happen with those state funds that were dedicated to that project? Would it just be utilized in a future year or maybe allocated to a different project?
So Brian, that's a great question. We've actually put a new tool into place this year to check in with everybody between the draft and final using some Google form technology to just check in with everybody to make sure that they're still planning to move forward and able to move forward with the items that were recommended in the draft 6-year program. Not yet received that feedback from everybody, but my thought is that if an agency were to relinquish a project, that would just go back into the balance and be allocated next year. That we've established our thresholds, and changing those thresholds makes it's not just bringing in one more project, it's typically bringing in a group if we want to change the threshold.
Okay, thank you.
I do want to also mention really quickly about the Flex STP and the funding for the small urban. Something that we have talked about previously with the TSDAC is the fact that Virginia agencies have not historically applied for a lot of federal discretionary programs. And that's something that we've really put a lot of emphasis on with our team this year to make sure that we are working closely to bring that funding to Virginia. So we want to partner with the transit agencies to help help you apply for those federal discretionary programs. If you want our help, we've got our, we were happy to provide technical assistance, or at a minimum provide letters of support. Our track record at DRPT right now for the transit discretionary programs is quite good. I'm very proud of our team and the work that they've put into the several discretionary programs recently that we've been successful in attaining that funding. And so, Brian, for you and others with small urbans that are concerned about that, we would be happy to help you and help bring that funding to the Commonwealth.
Any other questions or comments? By the way, if you've received a message in the chat from me, it was intended for one person, not just send it to everybody. Okay, anybody else?
So I was just going to put a plug in for, in terms of the federal discretionary, if there was a way for DRPT to help with the match going forward, that would be nice.
Yeah, that's something that we have talked about, how to document that and how to help, how to leverage merit with those discretionary programs, so that in all of those programs it gets into a chicken and an egg thing of what comes first, and so we're trying to figure that out.
I will echo Tom on that, especially timing, so we know when to connect with you to make sure everything gets all in alignment for those applications.
Yeah, very good point.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I guess we're ready to move on to operating.
All right. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. So we did, and we've touched on most of this already with the capital. We do have some recommendations for beyond fiscal year 23, and we've talked about a lot of this already. But looking at that just-in-time arrival, looking at the service impact factors, and we've touched on this in previous years and in our discussion today. And I also talked about that one. So as you can tell, I left my notes in the office where I expected to be today. So bear with me. My morning has not gone as planned. So we also talked about the capital needs assessment. All right, so I'll switch gears and talk about operating. For operating, I think everybody is familiar with their operating assistance flow chart. We are also in year 3 of allocating our operating assistance in accordance with this performance-based formula. So in terms of operating assistance, we do recognize, and we talked about this a little bit already, that our transit agencies have really faced just completely unprecedented conditions during the pandemic, and they have done a wonderful job of maintaining essential lifeline services for their communities. They have been on the front lines from day one, and that is not lost on us at all. And so, as Jamie indicated earlier, we know our operating assistance is important to those transit agencies, even though it offsets a portion of their operating expenses in a typical year. We know those agencies are counting on the state and counting on our operating assistance to get the job done. We have been monitoring the performance metrics across the system throughout the pandemic. Agencies continue to report to us on their performance metrics on a monthly basis. We've continued to validate that data. And what we have seen is, that performance has varied greatly across the state. It's varied greatly across different types of systems. And we've seen different systems have different levels of impacts to their ridership, and also have made different decisions on what service levels they need to provide or are able to provide. And so the recommendation that we made to the Commonwealth Transportation Board last week is that this performance data is a little bit all over the place. But that we think that the best way to handle the performance-based formula for this year is to carry forward our performance data that we use to calculate operating assistance for fiscal year 21, which is all pre-pandemic data. And it is the same. This is the same approach that the Federal Transit Administration is taking with the apportionment of federal funds. So the best thing to do is essentially to hold everybody harmless and just kind of put a pin in the performance metrics and the data that was used to calculate operating assistance for fiscal year 21. As Jamie indicated earlier, we were able to provide a 2% increase in the state transit operating assistance program. So that's overall. So you use the same performance metrics, you increase the budget by 2%. That essentially means that everybody's seeing the same 2% increase over what they received last year for operating. So in terms of our policy review, same thing as we have on the capital side. We have to do the annual review that we're doing now of our outcomes. Typically, this is where we start to tell you about, what changed year to year, how the different factors worked. But we didn't do that this year because we didn't use that new performance data. We are required to also do a review of the operating policy at least 3 years. And so at this point, we are not recommending any policy changes. Quite frankly, we didn't use the performance-based formula for FY22 by carrying forward all of the FY21 data due to COVID. And so it seems logical that we would wait and give the operating formula just a little bit more time to learn from how that process has been applied. This time I'm going to check and see if I have anything else. No. Okay. So with that, any questions on the operating policy side?
Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. It's probably a question and a comment. One, I totally concur with the concept of holding harmless and not using data that has no validity to anything, because we've never experienced a pandemic like this, at least in 100 years since the Spanish flu. But I'm wondering, since we have certain code requirements to do this review, and then we've set up these performance-based formulas, does the TSDAC need to do anything formally to concur with your recommendation and what you recommend to the CTB, or does that suffice when the CTB concurs or adopts it?
So it's not a code requirement to review every 3 years. It is a CTB policy requirement. I don't know, Jennifer, do you have a preference of do we need to do a formal concurrence, or can we go on consensus?
I think we could do it either way, actually. I don't think we have a formal sort of resolution established, but if we had something that's reflected in the minutes, that would be appropriate.
Sure. I'd certainly entertain a motion to simply endorse the recommendation of staff on this matter.
So move.
Second.
Okay. Moved and second. All in favor? All in favor, please. I'm sorry, any discussion?
I just want to make sure if any other TSDAC member has any comments or questions, I really appreciate putting a motion on the floor to make it more formal. So I would endorse the motion. I just wanted to make sure nobody else has any comments or questions to.
Great. Any discussion on this matter?
Mr. Chair, I just have one question. Since the performance-based has a 3-year rolling average for performance data, this may be preemptive, but I just wonder if there's been a discussion of how are we going to deal with that next year? If we 20.
Brad, that's a great question, and I don't know that I have a good answer. I think I'm watching FTA right now to see how they come out of it on their side, and kind of watching that process. But I do think we're going to have to figure out how to either bridge, or we will likely run a number of scenarios to figure out what the best approach is that's fair to everybody, because the impacts on the systems have been so different across the different systems in different parts of the state that trying to figure out how we bridge that across the 3-year rolling average, I think is a little bit of a challenge, and I think that's an opportunity where we can really lean into some data analytics and come up with some different options to do that.
Yeah, I thought that would be the answer, that it was a little preemptive, but just wanted to make sure it was on the table.
Mhm.
And then
Good
the
point,
thought
Brian.
process.
Any other comments or questions? All right, if not, then we'll call the question. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstention? All right, so we unanimously endorse that recommendation.
All right, thank you. All right, so a couple of other programmatic updates, and Andy has touched on both of these, so I think these are going to be pretty brief. He mentioned the TRIP program, and we talked about TRIP and the Transit Ridership Incentive Program with you at your last meeting. We have continued to work on the development of the TRIP program. We did, I believe we talked about it at your November meeting, talked about doing an RFI, and we've had some focus groups with transit agencies. This is a very tentative timeline, but we are nearing the point where we anticipate taking a recommended policy for the TRIP program to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. That is something that would be available, posted most definitely, much like we did with the merit process, for public comment. And we would then make any necessary adjustments and take that to the CTB for approval. So very similar approach to our other policies that we've done with the board. We're hoping to open our application cycle for TRIP in a mid-cycle way this summer with outreach, and then work through this fall to do a technical review of those applications, and then ultimately to get CTB action so that we can put that funding that was included in the budget to work on both our zero fare and low income projects, as well as the regional routes part of that program. Any questions on TRIP? All right, well, then I'm going to click on to my next slide, and that's just, again, Andy mentioned transit strategic plans. Tom had asked a question about those as well. We do have a lot that has happened with the transit strategic plans already, and some that are underway and funded. Hampton Roads Transit and Greater Lynchburg Transit, those were our two pilot agencies, but PRTC OmniRide has also completed their transit strategic plan. We do have 3 that are underway with Fairfax Connector, Petersburg, and Alexandria Dash. And then we have 2 that are funded in the draft 6-year program for Loudoun County and Fred. So as we discussed earlier, that implementation schedule will need to be revisited based on the budget language, and that's something, again, that we will bring back and share with the TSDAC at a future meeting.
Okay. Any questions about that?
This is Jamie. I had a question for those transit strategic plans that are actually underway now, just to get an idea of those that are underway and those that will be moving forward in the future, just how COVID has impacted the content of what you want to receive versus what the transit agencies are able to deliver during this time period. Since it's covering a longer period of time, I'm just wondering how you'll respond to, I'll just call it data gaps, information gaps, or maybe not as solid of a plan as you would have liked due to COVID. Or maybe it's not impacted at all, but I'm just curious overall, what have you seen over the past several months?
So the ones that are underway right now were all started prior to COVID. So they are processes that were underway. So I can just share our experience with some of the planning efforts that we have going on at DRPT, things like the Springfield to Quantico Enhanced Public Transportation Study. All of our data that we're working off of is still really pre-COVID data. And so everything ends up with a little bit of a caveat and some scenario planning on what a post-COVID environment might look like. So we haven't made any changes to the Transit Strategic Plan guidelines to account for COVID. But I would recommend that, you know, anybody that's either working on a transit strategic plan or is getting ready to start one to think about including some of that scenario or alternative scenario approach in their plan. And that's something that we can certainly work with you on, because I do think it's a challenge. We need to look towards our future, but right now it's not the easiest thing to do, because there are a lot of questions about what the rebound is going to look like and how long it's going to take, and it really, you know, it really varies considerably system to system.
And then I guess my other quick question for strategic plans and some of this data in general is just census information and new census information that's rolling out. Do you see any impact on any projects or plans, regardless if it's strategic plan or not? Is that being taken into account for DRPT at all? I mean, I'm sure it is, but I'm just curious, does it relate to any of the things we've discussed earlier on in the meeting and these types of efforts?
Yeah, I think I want to make sure I'm answering your question. I think you're talking about how it ties in with your capital plan and your request for funding. And, you know, we've built that annual update process in there to account for changes that happen year to year. So if you finish your transit strategic plan and things change, or there's an adjustment that needs to be made, we have a mechanism in the process to be able to do that. HRT is a great example of that. They finalized their transit strategic plan during the pandemic. I mean, so they've had to adjust, and they got regional funding that they didn't expect when they started their transit strategic plan. So as my wonderful team is reminding me that our TSP guidelines, they're like the baseline. There's a lot of places and directions you can go with that, and you know, we want to try to build a process that's something that is helpful to you and gives you some flexibility, but also gives us something to lean into for long-term capital planning over a 6 to 10 year period. So Jamie, we're happy to work with you as you guys get started.
All right, thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
All right. So I have the next thing on our agenda is next steps. And so this is kind of tentative because everything feels kind of tentative right now, but so our next steps would be to reconvene in the spring and into the summer of 2022. At that point, I feel like we're going to be in a different place. I'm hoping that we're in a different place with things like COVID, but we're also going to have another year under our belt to talk about the outcomes of the fiscal year 23 merit process. We're going to have an update on where those transit strategic plans are, and I think we'll also be getting very close to, close to completion on the equity and modernization study. That seems to line up well with looking at any potential modifications to merit at that point in time. So that's what we have outlined as our next steps. Obviously, if conditions or situations warrant, we can certainly adapt to whatever gets thrown at us. But that is our recommendation as to where we are right now.
Okay. Any comments, questions, concerns?
Chair, this is Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of for the record, to close the loop, a sub-bullet there would be to come back to the discussion we had earlier about how to bridge the performance data with the COVID in between, which I think fall into that, but just specifically call it out. Thank you.
Yeah, good point. Thanks.
All right. So that gives us an idea of what we'll be dealing with next time we get together, which will be about a year from now, unless something requires earlier meeting. Is that right? Yeah. Bridget, is there anything anybody who has public comment today?
I can lead that section if you'd like. All right. At this time, we'll open the floor for public comment. You will have 3 minutes to share your comments. If you have a comment at this time, please raise your hand in the participant panel and we will call you and unmute your line. I'll give it a second in case there are any technical issues. I'm not seeing any hands raised in the participant column, so I believe that concludes our public comment. If you did want to speak and you were not able to unmute your line or make yourself present, please send us an email at drptpr@drpt.virginia.gov and we will get your questions answered.
Great.
Thank
Anybody from the committee like to make any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm sorry we're not getting those great sandwiches we normally get at the TSDAC meeting.
Maybe we can get one delivered to you, Jim. Tom, congratulations on your retirement coming up soon, and thank you for all your good work. Welcome to Jamie and to Brian. Good to see everybody. Hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. And otherwise, entertain a motion to adjourn. Or I'll just adjourn the meeting. How about that?
There we go.
A non-debatable motion is made by me, okay? I move
All
forward.
right, great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you all very much. Good to be with you.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Okay. See you later, Jennifers.
Thanks,